Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to share some data from Asklepios with you. I thought I'd have a very short introduction about what Asklepios is as a study, and then focus on one of the things that we really are interested in, that's time-varying analysis as one of the biomarkers. And then also to talk about some recent findings that we have on familial clustering of cardiovascular disease and on family history within the study. And I'll just very shortly, in the meantime, talk a little bit about our re-examination. So the goal of the Asklepios study, our short-term goal, was to provide population-based insights on the interplay between hemodynamics, not hemodynamics, but hemodynamics, aging and cardiovascular disease emergence, with a long-term goal of developing better strategies, which is, of course, a very difficult long-term goal. For this, we took a random population sample of 2,500 subjects. They were aged between 35 and 55 at the time when we first studied them. So that was in 2002. So they are now approximately, on average, around 57 years of age. They were then 45. From two twin communities, very close to one another, and they were apparently healthy. They were extensively phenotyped. We tried to use, as best as possible, very stringent methodologies. For example, all of the echography or all of the tonometries were done by one single observer for all 2,500 subjects. We have a serum and a DNA biobank, where we're also looking at telomere length, for example, image data of the heart and the vessels in the carotid and the femoral arteries, and then a key number of very clean hemodynamic signals, pressure, flow, and distension, so diameters, to be able to model the cardiovascular system. And one of the main focus of interest that we have is looking at time-integrative biomarkers, biomarkers which reflect accumulation of subclinical cardiovascular damage, and therefore might be able to provide extra information on top of classic risk factors or risk markers that give you a life course risk factor burden. And they should be able to provide clinical useful information and help us guide therapy. This potential field is very broad. There are blood-borne biomarkers, telomere length, DNA methylation, metylomics, imaging-based biomarkers, which have already been discussed. I'll talk a little bit about the biomechanics-derived biomarkers, looking at not only arterial stiffness, but more in-depth ventricular-arterial coupling and ventricular-arterial interaction. So to do this time-varying analysis, you have to study both the heart and the arterial tree. We are very lucky that we have really a gold standard engineering team, which is a key part of our study. The first thing that we did is have, as best possible quality as we can, native pressure, flow, and dimension curves. And this gives you the possibility to study these time-varying phenomena. And then since we have an open door policy for collaboration, this really has helped us to attract a number of people, which has helped us enormously to develop a few of the ideas which we didn't have, or we didn't have the tools to pursue them in the first place. So this is our setup. We have pressure, flow, and dimension at the carotid artery, flow dimension at the heart, pressure in the brachial and radial arteries, and then pressure, flow, and dimension in the femoral arteries. Now, having these signals allows us to do either the classic frequency domain analysis, which you all know. So if you have, for example, a brachial pressure curve from tonometry and a carotid pressure curve, you can calibrate this so that you have a scaled carotid pressure waveform. If you have flow out of the heart, you can combine central pressure and central flow, and for example, calculate input impedance after Fourier analysis. Or you can, for example, combine them to do wave separation analysis, where you have a decomposition of the pressure wave into a forward and a backward pressure wave, because you have the flow information. And then you can truly look at reflection magnitude, not augmentation index, but truly the amplitude of reflected waves. Besides frequency domain analysis, you can also do time domain analysis. So for example, if you have a central pressure curve and you have a central flow curve, you can superimpose them on a XY axis. And then, for example, the slope of the flow versus pressure curves gives you the characteristic impedance of the proximal aorta. This is a lot of the work that we have been doing, and it has been spearheaded in part by Julio Chirinos from Pennsylvania, who's really a very nice and brilliant chap to work with. So if you ever get the chance to hear him talk, I would recommend that. Now the field has been moved forward enormously by the fact that we now have not only time-varying pressure and time-varying flow, but Speckle tracking really gives us the opportunity to have time-resolved dimensions of the heart and time-resolved thickening of the heart. And once you start to combine that, you get a very powerful tool. And this is a difficult slide, but I'll go through it with you. So in the top part, you have wall thickness, time-resolved. So this is wall thickness throughout the cardiac cycle, cavity throughout the cardiac cycle, so left ventricular volume. This is, of course, a blood pressure curve, central flow, and here you have the wall stress. So this is the true stress which the myocardial fibers see throughout a cardiac cycle. And this is a wall stress versus pressure curve. We started with an initial publication in Circ in 2009, and this was a simple proof of concept as whether we could do this in a non-invasive fashion, and this was the first time that such a myocardial stress curve had been derived non-invasively. And so this is the pressure curve. This is only during the systolic phase. So this is the ejection phase. So here you have the first pressure peak, and this is the second pressure peak of the reflected wave. So this is somebody with an augmentation index above 100% or above 1. And this is the instantaneous circumferential fiber stress that the heart sees. Now, the first thing that you'll notice is that the peak stress is actually very early in the ejection. It is before reflected waves arrive. And then the stress of the heart drops quite rapidly. Nothing special is happening here. It's simply that the heart is emptying, and then you have a smaller cavity. And because you have a smaller cavity, you, of course, have less stress. And the fact that the reflected pressure wave, which arrives quite late in systole, arrives at that time when the heart has almost emptied, makes for the fact that it actually doesn't really increase fiber stress a lot. Even though pressure is higher here, the stress that the heart sees is much lower. So these were the first findings, that the peak myocardial stress occurs quite early in systole, before there are important contributions of reflected waves. And in the presence of a normal LV ejection fraction, this mid-systolic shift of the pressure-stress relationship protects cardiomyocytes. Now, of course, that might be changed in other situations. And for example, in heart failure, if you have systolic heart failure and you are not emptying, you're not diminuting your cavity size. And if you get, at that moment, reflected pressure waves when your cavity size is still large, the impact, the deleterious impact on the heart could be far higher. After this proof of concept, we tried to see if we could do this on a large scale, on the entire population that we have. And it was indeed possible in the majority of cases. And this is, again, this pressure, this wall stress curve that you see during the systolic phase of the cardiac cycle. And in the multivariate model that we were able to do with, in this study, because the first one was only on 50 or 60 subjects, we indeed saw that peak myocardial stress is in a large part driven by systemic vascular resistance, stroke volume, heart rate, and then proximal aortic compliance. And end-systolic myocardial stress, which is far lower, this is where reflection magnitudes start to play. All of the other three parameters are quite similar. Systemic vascular resistance, stroke and heart rate shift places. But reflection magnitude plays in late systolic stress, and early systolic stress or peak myocardial stress is more a function of the proximal aorta. One of the interesting findings was that women consistently show higher wall stresses, independent of left ventricular geometry, arterial properties, and flow output. At any given time, they have a higher systolic wall stress, and this might be related to the differential susceptibility of women to heart failure. Now, all of these effects are invisible if you don't have these time-resolved curves, which allow you to really look in depth at what's happening at the level of the heart. This is the latest publication. I'm making it sound now as if this is a very logical conclusion of findings that we have. Most of the things happened more or less simultaneously, and the insights grew simultaneously. So this is not a pre-planned analysis step in 4 ways. This is again what I just showed you. This is the stress curve again. These are the determinants of peak myocardial stress and of end-systolic myocardial stress. So this is what the vasculature does on the heart. at a level of wall stress. But how does that translate into what the heart is seeing and what the heart is undergoing? And actually, this early myocardial stress isn't really associated with a worse diastolic or systolic function. If anything, it seems to be associated with somewhat better systolic or diastolic function. That might sound counterintuitive. We actually believe that it's simply because we're presenting the data the other way around. It's simply that if you have a very good systolic function, you have a very vigorous ejection, and you might develop higher stresses at that moment in time. So it's simply a marker of a good quality ejection. However, although it is small, this late or end systolic myocardial stress, which is driven by wave reflections, happens at a time when the heart is not really well placed to take care of that, because you're not in the stage of active cross-bridge formation. And this gives you clearly worse diastolic function and a worse systolic function. So it's not really a matter of when, the degree of stress that the heart sees, but it's when that stress occurs within the cardiac cycle. And late systolic stress seems to be clearly worse. And that is where reflection magnitude plays a key role. Does this have a clinical correlate? Well, we were very lucky to be able to collaborate with the people from MESA, and this is also an analysis that Julio did. So this is a general population sample, average age of 62, half of them men, half of them women, mean follow-up of nearly 8 years. They used radial tonometry, so they did not have central flow, but what we did is we took the radial tonometry curve and we used a standardized flow curve derived from our measurements, and we used that to calculate wave separation and reflection magnitude. And they looked at all cardiovascular events, heart cardiovascular events and heart failure, and you clearly see that for reflection magnitude, you have a very powerful predictor of all cardiovascular events, heart cardiovascular events, but certainly of incident heart failure. Augmentation index was barely borderline significant, clearly showing that having the data on reflection magnitude, it's a more powerful predictor of what is truly happening within the arterial tree. So, and this is in a fully adjusted model which includes all of the other possible confounders of heart failure. This is another way to look at the same data. This is incidence of heart failure, and in the blue line you have the people without hypertension and low reflection magnitude. People with hypertension and low reflection magnitude is the second green line. Being normotensive but having high wave reflections is actually worse for incident heart failure, and the combination is simply cumulative. And so arterial wave reflections certainly represent a potent, strong risk factor for CHF in the general population. I wish I could give you data from Asklepios, but we are not there yet. We are currently doing the second round, so we studied our initial cohort between 2002 and 2004. We're currently doing all the exams again, so we'll have a complete cluster of repeat measurements after 10 years of the arterial function, the cardiac function, the time-varying analysis, the confounders, so that we can truly look whether our data hold true when we are testing them prospectively. There will be an identical methodology. It's the same single observer doing all of the echoes again now after 10 years. So all of the echoes will be, and the tonometries by one observer 10 years ago and now again. And we have a lot of additions, microRNAs, spirometry, 3D cardiac echo. Sleep studies, we're doing sleep studies in everyone, ambulatory sleep studies. I think the data that will come out of that will be very interesting as well. And this is preliminary for the moment. We reached 95% success rate in having ambulatory sleep studies. 55% of subjects have no apnea, hypopnea episodes per hour. More than 45% of the population have some degree of apnea, hypopnea per hour. What the impact is of these low-grade sleep apneas is unknown. So that's one of the gaps in knowledge that we hope to fill in. And certainly, sleep-disordered breathing we know is related to a lot of cardiovascular effects, but also on inflammation and oxidative stress. It's one of the potent causes of having low-grade continuous inflammation. So I thought I'd end a little bit about family history, because we have a panel of very distinguished geneticists in the room, and people who are interested in family history. And just a short history, it starts in 1954, where Gertler and White showed that subjects with CVD had parents, or fathers at least, with twice as much CVD. It was followed then by Thomas and Cohen, who showed the same for brothers, but even more advanced. Slack and Evans showed that it was true in women as well in 66. And then in 84, it was clearly shown that it was an independent predictor of death due to cardiovascular disease. And since then, there have been many studies from everywhere in the world. And even if you go to very remote islands, for example, you see that actually the same holds true. So indeed, you are part of the European population. You are right. And it's now, of course, part of the European guidelines in 2012. So having a positive family history of CVD raises your CVD risk by a factor 1.7 to 2. And it's one of the few qualifiers which has a clear numerical quota of what the risk increase is. And the positive family history is defined as the occurrence of premature CVD, and that's below the age of 55 in men and below the age of 65 in women, in a first-degree relative. That's the classic definition. Now, of course, the reason that family history might code for so much is that it encompasses not only genetic information, but also lifestyle information that you get and education. And I want to touch on a few of these very quickly. So this is work by my PhD student, Caroline van Dalen. And she looked in the database that we have, and when I started the study 10 years ago, I developed a new family history questionnaire. And we tried to see if we could get additional data from that. And basically, if you look at the normal family history question for this moment in time, the classic question is there a first-degree relative with premature CVD? If the answer is yes, you have a positive family history. If it's no, you have a negative family history. Now, our definition includes data on second-degree relatives, non-premature CVD, and the number of affected relatives. The high-risk population stays the same, so it's an identical high-risk population equivalent to the ones in the guidelines, but what we've actually done is that we've split up this very large group of 80% of the population with a negative family history according to the guidelines into one where there's a moderate risk and a group of low risk. We actually have even more groups, so we can go really granular into the data, but I'll focus on these three categories. Our high family history risk group, so that's the same as in the guidelines. In our population, they have a higher BMI, higher waist, higher blood pressures, higher triglycerides, lower HDL. But what is interesting is that if you compare the low family history risk group to the moderate, so within the ones that do not have a family history according to the guidelines, if you split from that a lower risk group, you identify a subset with a far clearer profile of risk factors. They have clearly lower BMI, waist circumference, blood pressures, triglycerides, but also glycemia, also LDL cholesterol. Here, the high-risk group didn't have higher LDL cholesterol, fewer components of the metabolic syndrome, less diabetes. And more importantly, if you look at atherosclerosis, this is the conventional definition. So according to the guidelines, the ones which have a positive family history versus the ones with a negative family history, the difference in prevalence of atherosclerosis is quite small. It was actually not significant. If you look at our extended definition with high, moderate, and low groups, actually the step up in atherosclerosis is not versus moderate and high. The low-risk group identifies a group with a clearly lower level of atherosclerosis. And this is our crude data. The same holds true if you adjust for all possible risk factors. So if you look at the conventional definition, having a family history gives you a 10% excess risk of having atherosclerosis, but not significant. If you look at the extended definition, there's actually no step up in risk between high and moderate. It's the low-risk family history group, the absence of a family history of cardiovascular disease, which clearly identifies a much more homogeneous population subset with low risk factors, lower atherosclerotic burden. So this is certainly a phenotype which is interesting for further study. Since we have a long-standing interest in telomere biology, and I know that Peter has as well, we also looked at whether there were differences in telomere length on circulating peripheral blood leukocytes within the population according to the risk factor definitions. There were no differences, which seems to hold true with the data that we have, is that we feel that it's unlikely that inherited short telomeres are the primary abnormality in the development of atherosclerosis. We couldn't find any shorter telomeres in early atherosclerosis in our population, and that's the same as others have found. And there are also no shorter telomere length in families with clearly a positive family history of CVD. I'll just end with one last and very simple point, and that's educational achievement. Because this is the data, it's still unpublished, but the one that struck me most. The population that we have are women born between 1947 and 1967. If at that time you were born into a family where there was no cardiovascular disease, you had about a 55% or 53% chance of studying beyond secondary education. If you were born into families with progressively more and more cardiovascular disease, the odds of going beyond high school dropped. And if you were born in a family with clearly very prevalent cardiovascular disease, your odds of going beyond secondary education dropped from 53% to 17%. So being born into a family with highly prevalent cardiovascular disease doesn't only give you bad genes, it doesn't only give you bad habits, but it also kills off your possibility of further education, putting at jeopardy another generation down the line, of course. So I think that this is important because if we think about prevention, it also means that we have to tailor the message that we give so that people can understand it. Just leave me to say a big thanks to all my collaborators, without which nothing of this would have been possible, and I wouldn't even be able to show you one single slide. And to tell you, and this is in all seriousness, our door is always open for collaboration or for validation of whatever. Be free to contact us.